Pirate navigation. How criminals crossed oceans with bad maps and dead reckoning. It is 2 in the morning somewhere in the Caribbean, and the man at the stern is not sleeping. He is standing over a chart, spread flat on a wooden box, one hand on a compass, the other pressed against the edge of the table to keep his balance as the hull rolls through the swell. The lantern above him is turned low because a bright light at the stern means a visible ship, and a visible ship tonight is a problem. He is trying to calculate where they are. Not approximately where, not roughly where. He needs a position accurate enough to thread through a channel between 2 islands before sunrise. Because somewhere on the other side of those islands there is a merchant lane that runs northeast toward Port Royal. And the captain wants to be sitting across that lane by first light. The captain wants a prize. The navigator wants to not put the ship on a reef. Those 2 things are in direct conflict tonight, and the navigator knows it. Ahead of them, somewhere in that darkness, is a reef system that appears on his chart as a dotted line, and a brief notation that translates roughly as shoals reported here. Not measured, not sounded, reported, by someone at some point whose name is not on the chart. This is the document that is supposed to get them through the night. This is what most films about pirates skip entirely. The cannon is cinematic. The flag makes a clean image. The captain shouting orders at the bow looks like leadership. But the thing that actually kept a pirate operation alive, the thing that determined whether a crew made it to the prize lane or broke apart on rock in the dark, was navigation. And in the golden age of piracy, navigation was a rough, imperfect, pressure-filled job performed with tools that were barely adequate, charts that were often wrong, and consequences that were absolute. Welcome to Deadman's Shore. I am Jack, and today we are talking about how pirates actually crossed oceans when everything they were using to do it was incomplete, uncertain, or flat-out wrong. Let us start with the myth, because it is everywhere. The treasure map. Yellowed parchment, burned edges, a red cross marking the spot, a dotted line showing the route. It is the single most recognized symbol of piracy in popular culture, and it is almost entirely fictional. Real pirates did not use treasure maps. They used navigational charts, rudders, compass readings, sounding lines, and accumulated route knowledge they either stole, purchased from corrupt port officials, or pulled out of prisoners who had sailed the same waters before them. The treasure map as a concept was mostly invented by writers in the 19th century. Most famously Robert Louis Stevenson in Treasure Island, published in 1883. The pirates of the Golden Age, operating roughly from the 1680s through the 1720s, were dealing with a completely different problem. They were not looking for buried loot. They were trying to find ships carrying cargo, bring those ships to a port where the cargo could be sold, and do it again without getting caught. That required knowing where to go, how to get there, how to get back, and how to avoid the people who wanted to stop them. Navigation was not optional. It was the whole operation. Here is the problem in its most basic form. You are at sea. You cannot see land. You do not have a satellite. You do not have a radio. What you have is a compass, a rough sense of how fast your ship is moving, an hourglass, and your last known position, which may itself have been an estimate. From these things you have to figure out where you are. This method is called dead reckoning, and it was the primary navigation tool for almost every vessel in the period, naval, merchant, and pirate alike. The principle is straightforward. You know where you started. You know what direction you have been sailing, because the compass tells you. You know roughly how fast you have been moving, because you have been tracking it with a log line dropped off the stern. You know how long you have been sailing, because someone has been flipping the hourglass. Multiply your speed by your time, apply it along your compass course, and you get a new position. That position is your best guess. It is also an approximation, because there is one thing dead reckoning cannot easily account for: current. The ocean is not a flat, motionless surface. It is a system of moving water, flowing in directions that do not always match the direction the wind is sending your ship. A current running 2 knots sideways against your course will shift your actual track away from your compass course, without you feeling it, without your compass showing it, and without your hourglass catching it. After 12 hours of sailing, you think you are 60 miles along a heading of northeast. You might actually be well off that, pushed sideways by water you could not see and did not measure. If there is a reef where you think there is open water, that matters enormously. Pirates knew this. Every experienced sailor knew this. The question was not whether current existed. It was whether you knew enough about the currents in your stretch of ocean to correct for them. In familiar water, experienced navigators made reasonable adjustments. In unfamiliar water, they were guessing. And pirate operations frequently took ships into waters the navigator had never. The tools themselves are worth understanding, because knowing what navigators were actually working with explains how much pressure existed in every calculation they made. The compass was the most critical instrument on board, but compasses in this period were not perfectly reliable. Magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, varied significantly by location. A navigator who knew the variation for one region and sailed into a region with different variation without adjusting for it was building error into every course from that point forward. Tables existed for magnetic variation, but they were incomplete and sometimes wrong. Speed was measured with the log line. A piece of wood was thrown off the stern and allowed to float while a knotted line attached to it ran out. A sailor counted how many knots passed through his hands in a fixed time measured by a sandglass, usually 30 seconds. This gave speed in knots, a term we still use today. The problem was the sandglass. A sandglass running slightly fast or slow produced speed estimates that compounded into real navigational error over hours. The lead line was the depth sounder of the period. A lead weight on a marked line dropped over the side told you the depth below the keel. This was essential in shallow coastal water. When approaching a coastline at night, a sailor at the bow called out readings every few minutes, while the helmsman watched for any sudden drop in depth. That meant rocks were closer than anyone wanted. Charts varied so wildly in quality that using one required constantly judging how much to trust it. Most were based on earlier charts, updated where new surveys existed and left unchanged where they did not. Whole stretches of coastline were drawn from single surveys conducted decades earlier, surveys that were often rushed and conducted by observers who were more interested in leaving than in measuring carefully. Reef systems were particularly badly charted because mapping a reef required slow, patient soundings that many surveyors simply did not complete before publication. The result was charts that showed clean open water. Here is where one of the most underappreciated tools of pirate navigation comes in: the captured pilot. When a pirate crew took a prize in coastal or island waters they were not familiar with, one of the most valuable things on that prize was sometimes not the cargo. It was a man, a local coastal trader, a port pilot, a fishing captain who had spent years navigating the channels and anchorages of the area. This man knew things no chart contained. He knew the unmarked channels through reef systems. He knew which anchorages silted up in rainy season and which held good depth year-round. He knew where the patrol boats from the colonial garrison typically ran. He knew where fresh water could be found without going into a settlement where people would recognize the ship. Captured pilots were sometimes held aboard for weeks or months. Admiralty trial depositions from this period include accounts from pilots who described being forced to navigate for pirate vessels across considerable distances, under conditions where refusing was not a realistic option. Some of these men eventually testified against the crews that held them. Some were released in ports far from home with no explanation. Some disappear from the records entirely. The value of a good pilot was practical and direct. A crew that could thread through unmarked channels and anchor in hidden bays that did not appear on official charts was a crew that was harder to find, harder to intercept, and harder to bring to trial. The chart was the official version of the coastline. The pilot was the real one. Trade winds gave pirates a structural advantage that is easy to underestimate. The Atlantic and Caribbean operate on predictable wind systems. The northeast trades blow steadily toward the Caribbean. The westerlies in higher latitudes run the opposite direction. Seasonal patterns. The hurricane season in the Caribbean, the monsoon in the Indian Ocean, determined when shipping moved and what route it took. A navigator who understood those systems could predict not just where merchant vessels would be, but approximately when they would arrive in particular locations. This is why certain sea lanes became reliably profitable. Ships did not wander randomly. They followed routes dictated by wind, current, season, and destination. A pirate crew operating in the Windward Passage, the channel between Cuba and Hispaniola that funneled a large portion of Atlantic traffic heading north, was not hunting randomly. They were in a location where ships were predictably going to appear. The same logic applied in the Indian Ocean, where Henry Avery and his contemporaries in the 1690s understood that Mughal merchant traffic made regular seasonal voyages between India and the Red Sea port of Mocha. If you knew when the fleet sailed and what route it took, you did not need perfect navigation. You needed to be roughly in the right ocean at the right time of year and use your eyes. The hunt was far less random than it appeared from the outside. But here is where the myth of the expert pirate navigator starts to crack, and this part matters. Most pirate ships did not carry trained navigators. The Royal Navy trained navigators over years of service on properly equipped vessels with access to updated charts and experienced officers. Merchant vessels had sailing masters who knew their regular routes. Pirate crews were assembled from whoever was available, typically former merchant sailors, naval deserters, privateersmen whose employment had ended with the latest war, and the occasional impressed man who had decided piracy offered better terms than the vessel he had been forced onto. Some of these men had real navigational ability. Others were good at sailing conditions they understood and unreliable in unfamiliar water. A crew that had sailed the same Caribbean circuit 20 times had accumulated route knowledge that was genuinely useful, a kind of collective navigation built from shared experience. Take that crew into a new ocean, and the margins got very thin very fast. Bartholomew Roberts, who operated across the Atlantic from the Caribbean to West Africa between 1719 and 1722, consistently moved his vessels across enormous distances. The voyage from the Caribbean to the coast of West Africa, where Roberts was killed at Cape Lopez in 1722, required sustained navigational competence across weeks of open ocean. The records from the Cape Coast Castle trial, where over 50 members of his crew were prosecuted following his death, make clear this was not a crew following coastlines from anchorage to anchorage. They were crossing open ocean on courses that required real dead reckoning ability and a solid reading of trade winds and currents. Roberts had that. Not every captain did. And the captains who did not left fewer records because the Longitude Problem deserves its own moment here, because it was genuinely serious, and it affected every navigator in the period regardless of skill. Latitude, your position north or south of the equator, could be calculated with reasonable accuracy using a quadrant to measure the sun's angle at noon. The method was imperfect but workable. Longitude, your east-west position, was a fundamentally harder problem. The only reliable method of determining longitude requires knowing the precise time difference between your location and a known reference location. Because the sun moves across 15 degrees of longitude per hour, accurate marine timekeepers, chronometers, were not widely available until the 1770s. John Harrison's solution to the problem was not in service during the golden age of piracy. Every navigator in this period, pirate, naval, or merchant, was working without a reliable fix on their east-west position over long ocean passages. The practical result was that navigators had a decent sense of their latitude and a much rougher sense of how far east or west they were. Over a long passage, this could accumulate into significant error. A ship that was correct in latitude but 30 miles off in longitude could encounter a coastline in a completely unexpected location. The standard response was caution on approach. Experienced navigators established their latitude first, then ran down that latitude toward the coast, using the lead line and lookouts to pick up depth readings and landmarks before committing to any channel or anchorage. This was slower than sailing directly at your destination. But it was the method that actually worked, and it separated navigators who consistently brought ships home from those who occasionally did not. You want to know what a bad navigation decision looked like in practice? Look at the Whydah. The Whydah was a former slave ship captured by Samuel Bellamy, known as Black Sam, in the winter of 1717. Bellamy turned it into his flagship, a fast and well-armed raider operating off the New England coast. On the night of April 26, 1717, a massive storm came up on the Massachusetts coast with very little warning. The Whydah was caught near Cape Cod, a stretch of coastline that was then, as it is now, a graveyard of wrecked vessels. The ship went down with almost all hands. Bellamy was among those killed. Of the more than 140 men aboard, only 2 survived. The Whydah wreck was not a simple failure of seamanship. Storms of that severity could destroy well-maintained naval vessels with experienced crews, but the episode shows the central vulnerability of every operation at sea. Weather moves fast, and if your ship is in the wrong position when it does, navigation cannot overcome physics. Bellamy had built a real operation in a short time. He did not survive his first serious encounter with the New England coast, in conditions that coastline is capable of producing. Knowing where you were mattered every day. It mattered most when the conditions changed without warning. And by the time you needed, the Indian Ocean presented a different set of challenges, and the pirates who operated there successfully were working with a different kind of complexity. Pirate operations off Madagascar in the 1690s and early 1700s were built around the monsoon system, which reversed wind direction seasonally and structured the entire shipping calendar of the region. The southwest monsoon ran from roughly May through September and made sailing from East Africa toward India favorable. The northeast monsoon reversed the equation from October through April. Every merchant route in the Indian Ocean, every Mughal trading voyage, every East India Company ship moving between India and England was governed by these patterns. For a navigator without a detailed chart of the Indian Ocean, but with knowledge of monsoon timing, this was real operational intelligence. You knew which direction merchant traffic would be moving at any given time of year. You could position yourself on the approach routes to major ports without an accurate chart of the specific channels, because the wind patterns were the chart. Madagascar itself was a critical navigational asset. The island is roughly 1,000 miles from north to south. Its eastern coast faces the open Indian Ocean and offered anchorages that did not appear on European charts because European surveys of the area were incomplete. A ship anchored in one of those bays with lookouts on high ground was functionally invisible to naval patrols working from charts that did not show it. The navigational knowledge of Madagascar, held by pirate crews in this period, was built from direct experience rather than any official document. Which channels were safe, where fresh water could be found away from settlements, the behavior of currents along the western coast, the anchorages where a ship could beach itself, and clean the hull of the weed and worm that accumulated on any wooden vessel at sea for months. This knowledge was shared between crews, passed from vessel to vessel, accumulated over years. It worked right up until the Royal Navy began sending vessels specifically tasked with learning that same geography. The moment where the navigation advantage collapses is also the moment where the suppression of piracy becomes genuinely effective. The navigational advantage pirates held depended on the other side, not knowing the same waters. Throughout the early years of the Golden Age, colonial governors had general knowledge that piracy was occurring across large ocean areas, but limited specific intelligence about where any particular operation was based and what routes it used. That changed. Captured crew members testified, sometimes at trial, sometimes before reaching trial. Former pirates who accepted the pardons offered by the Crown in the 1710s came back to port with detailed knowledge of the geography pirate operations depended on. Merchants released from captivity filed depositions describing anchorages where they had been held. Naval officers tasked with suppression began accumulating the same coastal and route knowledge that had previously been the operational advantage of the people they were hunting. Whydah Rogers, who arrived in Nassau in 1718 as the first royal governor of the Bahamas, with specific instructions to end the pirate sanctuary that the island had become, was working from an intelligence base significantly richer than anything his predecessors had. He knew which captains used Nassau as a base. He had route information about how they operated in the surrounding waters. He came with a naval escort that could physically control the harbor. The navigational geography that had protected pirate operations in the Bahamas, the shallow banks, the cut-through channels only accessible to shallow draft vessels, the multiple escape routes, did not disappear. But the advantage that knowledge of that geography provided was dramatically reduced when the other side also had it. Roberts was found at Cape Lopez on the West African coast because a naval squadron was specifically tasked to search that coast and had enough route knowledge to conduct a systematic search rather than a random patrol. The squadron found him, caught his crew sleeping off a night of drinking, and ended the operation in a single morning. The navigation got the Navy there. The intelligence told them where to look. Henry Avery, the most successful pirate of the early Golden Age in terms of raw prize value, was never caught. He sailed the Fancy out of the Indian Ocean, crossed the Atlantic, and disappeared. He remains one of the few major pirate captains of the period who evaded capture entirely. The most straightforward explanation is this. He went somewhere that the people looking for him did not know to look and had no chart for. Let us come back to where we started. 2 in the morning. somewhere in the Caribbean. A man standing over a chart that does not entirely tell the truth. He knows his starting point. He knows his heading. He knows roughly how long he has been sailing and at what speed. He has a picture of the current patterns in this stretch of water, built from previous voyages, and the account of a pilot they released at the last port. He knows where the reef system begins because a merchant captain they took 3 weeks ago marked it on a rough sketch before they let him go. He knows that the patrol out of the English garrison runs 1 sweep a week and was last seen 2 days ago heading north. He is not navigating by instinct. He is not following a treasure map. He is working a system of overlapping, imperfect, constantly updated information